In the shallow, murky water of a Bavarian lake, two men were found one evening in June of 1886. One was a king, the ruler of an ancient dynasty, known to the world as the man who built the castle that would later inspire Walt Disney. The other was the very doctor who, just days earlier, had declared that king to be hopelessly insane. The official story was written in a matter of hours, a tragic end for a troubled mind. A desperate king, they said, had taken his own life in the cold water. But this tidy explanation never truly made sense. For one, the king was an expert swimmer, and when they examined him, they found no water in his lungs. Then there were the marks of a fierce struggle on the doctor's body, and the local fisherman who found them, who suddenly became a wealthy man and was told to forget everything he saw that night. What truly happened in that water has been protected by secrets for over a century, hidden away in classified files. But the story doesn't begin with a death. It begins with a photograph, a simple portrait that should have been burned, but instead it exposed a secret kingdom built in the dark and set in motion a conspiracy that could only end here in the silent waters of the lake. To understand how a king's life could end so tragically in the shallows of a lake, we have to travel back in time, back to when he was just a boy of 18, a sensitive prince standing in a gilded throne room, feeling utterly alone. His name was Ludwig, and in 1863 he was the heir to the Bavarian crown. His world was one of rigid ceremony and suffocating expectations. Every day was a performance, every conversation a political maneuver. And then, one day, a man walked into that room who would change everything. Prince Paul von Thurn und Taxis was an aide-de-camp, an officer in a pristine uniform of gold buttons and perfect posture. The Bavarian court was filled with handsome young men, but when Ludwig's eyes met Paul's, something profound and unspoken passed between them. It was a connection that the world of 1860s Bavaria had no acceptable name for, only dangerous whispers. In a life defined by duty, Ludwig had found a person who saw not the prince, but the man. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Long after the palace had grown quiet and the courtiers had retired to their beds, Paul would make his way to Ludwig's private chambers. Their official daytime correspondence was everything you'd expect, formal, polite, and carefully worded. But hidden away, another set of letters tells the real story. Miraculously, a few of these notes survived, forgotten in an archive instead of being burned. They are a window into a love that was never meant to see the light of day. "Dear and beloved Ludwig," Paul wrote in one, "my heart beats only for you. I am consecrated to you, body and soul." These were not the words of a mere friend. They were the words of a man deeply in love. Ludwig, in return, wrote with a passion that felt almost desperate, a passion that his enemies would one day twist and use as evidence of his supposed madness. "You are the sun in my darkness," the young prince confessed. "When you are away, I cannot eat, cannot sleep. I pace my chambers like a caged animal until you return. But a palace is built of glass. Every hallway has ears, every doorway has eyes. Servants saw the late-night visits. Ministers noticed the prince's stolen glances. Soon, the whispers that started in the corridors of the palace found their way into the beer halls of Munich. The young heir to the throne, they murmured, seemed to prefer the company of his aide-de-camp to any of the eligible princesses presented to him. A scandal was brewing, and the royal family knew something had to be done before it boiled over. The first to act was Ludwig's mother, Queen Marie. She summoned Prince Paul to a private meeting. No official record exists of the words that were exchanged in that room, but we can imagine the cold, quiet command of a queen protecting her son's future, and the dynasty itself. We do not know what was said, but we know what happened next. That very night, Paul was gone. Transferred to a remote military post in Prussia, he was effectively exiled from Ludwig's life, and he would never be allowed to return. For Ludwig, the heartbreak was immediate and absolute, but with it came a bitter lesson, one that would shape the rest of his existence. He learned that for a man in his position, love would always be a secret, and that secret would always be in danger. His heart taught him that love meant loss. In the lonely months that followed, something began to shift inside the young prince. At first, the changes were small. He would miss a morning council meeting. He would arrive late to an afternoon reception. By the time winter fell over Munich, the court noticed that Prince Ludwig was rarely seen at all before sunset. One worried minister wrote that His Highness seems to have developed an aversion to daylight itself. The court believed it was simply grief, and in a way they were right. But it was more than that. During those cherished secret hours with Paul, Ludwig had discovered something essential. In the darkness, when the respectable world was asleep, the heavy mask of the perfect prince could finally come off. The night offered a freedom the day could never permit. It was in the shadows that he could breathe. It was in the shadows that he could be himself. And then, in 1864, his carefully constructed private world was shattered. His father, King Maximilian II, passed away suddenly. At just 18 years old, Ludwig of Bavaria was no longer a prince hiding from the light. He was the king. The crown itself weighed less than 4 pounds. But for Ludwig, its weight was unbearable. Now the future of the entire 700-year-old Bavarian monarchy rested on his shoulders. The kingdom, his family and his legacy, all depended on his ability to do the one thing he knew in his heart he could never truly do: love a woman, marry, and produce an heir. The pressure from his ministers was relentless. In 1867, it seemed they had finally succeeded. The court announced with great celebration King Ludwig's engagement to the beautiful Princess Sophie, a cousin and the sister of the famous Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Sophie was intelligent, kind, and by all accounts the perfect future queen. The wedding was set, invitations were sent to royal houses all across Europe, and for a brief moment it seemed that Ludwig would submit to his royal duty. But as the date drew closer, the king grew more and more agitated. He postponed the wedding once, then a second time, offering flimsy excuses. The court grew anxious. Finally, in October, he could not bear the lie any longer. He called Sophie to a private meeting. According to her own journals, his words to her were gentle, but firm. "I cannot do this to you," he explained. "You deserve a husband who can love you completely. I am not that man. I will never be that man." The engagement was broken, a public humiliation for the crown. But remarkably, Sophie seemed to understand the truth behind his painful confession. She would live out her life, never marrying another, once saying, "How could I, after being loved by Ludwig?" But in this she was mistaken. The king had respected her, but he hadn't loved her. His heart, he knew, was already reserved for another kind of love, a love he would have to find far from the public eye, in the growing darkness he now called home. The king's heart was not empty. It was simply hidden. His affections had found a new home, not in the gilded halls of the palace, but in the quiet warmth of the royal stables. The man who captured his attention was named Richard Hornig, a young groom who was responsible for the king's horses. He had calm blue eyes and a gentle demeanour, a world away from the scheming and ambition of the royal court. In Hornig, Ludwig saw a kindness and a simplicity that he craved. And crucially, he saw someone who was of such a different social standing that no one, he hoped, would ever suspect the true nature of their bond. But a king's favour is impossible to hide for long. Within a year, the young groom was no longer working in the stables. He was promoted to master of the horse, and then to the king's personal aide. Ludwig showered him with gifts: a beautiful property on the lake, a salary that rivaled a government minister's, and something far more valuable: unlimited private access to the king himself. In the pages of his secret diary, which would only be discovered long after his death, Ludwig referred to Hornig as the beloved of my soul. Yet those same diary pages reveal a man at war with himself. On one page, he would write beautiful, soaring declarations of his love for Hornig. On the next, he would fill the page with desperate prayers for forgiveness, confessing his sins to a God he felt was always watching. He was torn between the truth of his heart and the rigid morality of his time. "I am damned," he wrote in one tortured entry from 1869, "but damnation with him is sweeter than salvation alone." It was during this period of intense inner conflict that King Ludwig made a decision that would define his legacy and baffle the world for over a century. He decided he would not just create a secret life, but he would build a secret kingdom, a world made of stone and mortar, designed to protect what he held most dear. He would build a castle, not a fortress for defence or a palace for government, but a medieval fantasy brought to life perched on a dramatic cliff overlooking a valley. He would call it Neuschwanstein, the new swanstone. Historians and ministers at the time saw it as a reckless extravagance, a foolish waste of money. But they were missing the point. Every single detail in Neuschwanstein was designed for one purpose: privacy. Secret passages connected the king's bedchambers to other rooms. Hidden doors were built so that servants could deliver meals or draw baths and then disappear without ever being seen. The grandest room in the entire castle was the throne room, a breathtaking space decorated with magnificent mosaics of angels and saints. But this glorious room held one very telling secret. The throne itself was never built. A golden platform stands there to this day, empty, because Ludwig never intended to hold court at Neuschwanstein. It was not a castle for royal business, it was a sanctuary for royal secrets. And it was here, within these rising walls, that Ludwig's transformation into the Night King became complete. The shift was so gradual that at first, few took notice. He would schedule meetings for the late afternoon, then the early evening. By 1875, the king's new reality was set. He had reversed his entire existence. King Ludwig II of Bavaria now woke at 7 in the evening, ate his breakfast around midnight, had lunch at 3 in the morning, and took dinner just as the sun was rising before finally going to bed. His court was bewildered. His ministers were infuriated. Historians would later call this behaviour a clear sign of his deteriorating mental state. But they were wrong. It wasn't madness. It was a carefully constructed defence. Ludwig had created a shadow kingdom, a parallel world that came alive only in the dark, populated by people who, like him, felt they couldn't truly exist in the harsh light of day. There was Hornig, of course, but there were others too. Young actors from the theatres in Munich, musicians who would play private concerts for an audience of one. Nowhere was this private world more spectacular than in the Venus grotto he constructed at his other palace, Linderhof. To the public, it was presented as a whimsical tribute to an opera by his favourite composer, Richard Wagner. But its true purpose was far more personal. It was an elaborate stage set for his innermost fantasies. Imagine an artificial cave, nearly 300 feet long, with a man-made lake heated to a perfect 82 degrees Fahrenheit. A hidden machine could create gentle waves on the water. Musicians would play Wagner's stirring music from behind artificial rocks, their sound echoing through the cavern. And in the middle of the lake, a golden boat, shaped like a giant seashell, would float, carrying the king and his chosen companion for the evening. This underground wonderland was illuminated by a revolutionary lighting system, powered by one of Germany's very first electrical power stations, built for the pleasure of a single man. The lights could change the colour of the entire grotto at the flick of a switch. Red light could transform the cave into a mountain of sensual passion from the opera. Blue light could make it feel like the famous Blue Grotto of Capri, a place where ancient Roman emperors once held their own secret gatherings. But most importantly, the lights could be extinguished in an instant, plunging the entire grotto into absolute silent darkness, should any unexpected visitors arrive. The servants who worked these night shifts were hand-picked, and paid a fortune for their labour, and more importantly for their silence. But even enormous sums of money could not prevent whispers from eventually escaping this hidden world. By the 1880s, troubling reports began to find their way to the desks of Ludwig's ministers. They heard stories that the king was requiring young male servants to perform private dances without their uniforms. One report, filed by a disgruntled former valet, described scenes that would later be used as key evidence against the king. His Majesty commands performances, the man wrote, where young men chosen for their beauty must dance before him, wearing only garlands of flowers. These stories might have been dismissed as the bitter lies of a fired employee, destined to be buried in a dusty file, if not for what happened next. The beginning of the end arrived in 1881, and it came in the form of a 23-year-old actor named Joseph Kainz. Ludwig first saw him on stage at the Munich Court Theatre, and was immediately captivated. It wasn't that Kainz was the most brilliant actor in Germany, but he possessed a confidence and a charm that drew the lonely king in. That very night, a royal summons was sent to the theatre. For most, a private late-night audience with the increasingly reclusive king would have been a terrifying prospect. But Kainz was ambitious, and he was intrigued by the mysterious monarch who lived his life in reverse. That first meeting lasted until the sun came up. What they spoke of, we will never know. But just 1 week later, Ludwig invited the young actor to accompany him on a trip to Switzerland. He wasn't invited as an entertainer, he was invited as a companion. The trip was meant to be a secret. The king travelled under a false name, Count von Berg, with Kainz posing as his personal secretary. But Ludwig, so often meticulous about his privacy, made a single, fatal mistake. Lost in the happiness of the moment, he allowed a local photographer to take their portrait. That photograph. It should have been a simple souvenir, a private memento. Instead, it would become the piece of evidence that brought a kingdom to its knees. In the portrait, the young actor, Joseph Kainz, is sitting comfortably in an ornate chair, a relaxed, almost knowing smile on his face, and standing next to him, like an attendant, is Ludwig II, the King of Bavaria. In the rigid world of a 19th century royal protocol, this was more than a scandal. It was an impossibility. A king never ever stands while a commoner sits, but it's their expressions that tell the whole story. Kynes looks directly into the camera, confident and self-assured. Ludwig, however, is not looking at the camera. He's gazing at Kynes, and the look on his face is one of complete, unguarded adoration. It is the look of a man hopelessly in love. When copies of that photograph made their way back to Munich, Ludwig's government ministers were horrified. It wasn't just the shocking breach of protocol. It was what the image so clearly revealed. The king's deepest secret, the truth he had spent 2 decades carefully concealing in the shadows, was now visible for anyone to see. The kingdom of night had been dragged into the light. For Ludwig's political enemies, the photograph was a gift. One man in particular, Count Maximilian von Hohenstein, a former friend who had become a bitter rival, saw his opportunity. He began to quietly gather a file. He collected the photograph, the sworn testimonies from disgruntled former servants, and receipts for the lavish gifts Ludwig had given to his male companions over the years. The most damning evidence of all came from the king's own private diaries, stolen by a valet who had been bribed. But Hohenstein was a shrewd politician. He knew that in the aristocratic circles of Bavaria, the king's private preferences alone might not be enough to dethrone him. Such things were often tolerated as long as they remained discreet. No, to remove a king, he needed something more powerful. He needed to prove that Ludwig wasn't just unconventional. He needed to prove that he was insane. And so, he turned to Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, Bavaria's most famous psychiatrist, a man with his own professional ambitions. Dr. Gudden was tasked with creating a medical report on the king's mental state. There was just one problem. Dr. Gudden had never met King Ludwig. He had never examined him, never spoken a single word to him, never even been in the same room, but that didn't stop him. The report he produced in March of 1886 is a masterclass in medical fabrication. Working from the stolen diary entries and the gossipy testimonies, Gudden twisted every one of Ludwig's eccentricities into a symptom of severe mental illness. The king's reverse sleep schedule, a clear sign of a diseased mind, his love for private theatrical performances, delusions of grandeur, his deep and emotional relationships with men, a moral insanity that made him unfit to rule. But what the report truly said between the lines was something far simpler. King Ludwig wasn't insane. He was inconvenient. His fairytale castles were costing a fortune, plunging the royal treasury into debt, and his increasingly open relationships were becoming a public embarrassment that his government could no longer contain. The conspiracy moved with breathtaking speed. On June 10th, 1886, based entirely on Dr. Gudden's report, King Ludwig II was officially declared insane and unfit to rule. His uncle was named regent, and a commission was dispatched to Neuschwanstein to take the king into custody. Ludwig received a warning just hours before they arrived. His loyal servants, the ones who had guarded his secrets for so long, urged him to flee. His cousin, the Empress of Austria, had even arranged for escape carriages to be waiting at the border. For a moment he considered it, but then a wave of resignation seemed to wash over him. Where would a deposed king go? He asked his valet, his voice heavy with defeat. What life is there for a Ludwig who is no longer king? When the commission, led by Dr. von Gudden himself, arrived at the castle at 4 a.m, they found the king in his bedroom, fully dressed, waiting for them. For the first time, the doctor came face to face with the man whose life he had destroyed from a distance. "How can you declare me insane?" Ludwig asked him, his voice calm. "You have never even examined me." Dr. Gudden's reply was chilling. "It was not necessary," he said. "The documentary evidence is overwhelming." They escorted the king from his dream castle and took him to Berg Castle on the shores of Lake Starnberg. They told the public it was for his treatment, but everyone knew the truth. This wasn't a hospital, it was a prison. And from this prison, King Ludwig would never leave alive. On the evening of June 13th, less than 2 days after he was imprisoned in his own castle, King Ludwig made a simple request. He asked Dr. von Gudden to accompany him on a walk by the lake. It had been raining, but the storm was starting to pass. The doctor, perhaps feeling a pang of guilt, or perhaps just overconfident in his authority, agreed. He even made the fateful decision to dismiss the guards who were supposed to follow them at a distance. "The king is calm," he assured them. "We need no protection." They left at 6:30 in the evening. They never returned. When search parties were sent out hours later, they made the grim discovery in the shallow water, just 75 feet from the shore. The official verdict was declared almost immediately. The mad king, in a final fit of insanity, had attacked his doctor and then drowned himself. Case closed. But the scene itself told a different story. Ludwig was found in water that was barely waist deep. There were scratches on the doctor's face and marks on his neck suggesting a violent struggle. And then there was the fisherman, Jakob Liedler, who found them. Within a year, this poor local man was suddenly wealthy enough to buy property and become the mayor of his town. He never spoke of that night, but in private papers discovered after his death, he wrote a chilling line. The king was escaping. I heard the shot. Who fired that shot? Who paid for that fisherman's silence? The Bavarian government holds those secrets to this day, in files still deemed too sensitive to be opened. We are left with the heartbreaking irony of Ludwig's legacy. The man who was declared insane for spending too much money on his castles has become Bavaria's greatest treasure. Those follies, Neuschwanstein and the others, now generate millions upon millions for the state every year. We walk through his private sanctuaries, marvelling at the beauty, taking pictures of the dream world he built. We see everything except the truth of the lonely man who built them, a man who simply wanted to create a place where he could finally truly be himself. He was a king who lived in darkness, and for that he was forced to die in the light. The story of King Ludwig is one of those historical mysteries that truly stays with you, leaving us with far more questions than answers. I would genuinely love to read your own thoughts on this tragic story in the comments below. Was this a political conspiracy from the start, or simply a tragedy that spun out of control? If you appreciate these explorations into the forgotten chapters of the past, a simple like on the video lets us know to continue finding stories like this one, and by subscribing to the channel, you ensure that you'll be with us for the next journey we take together. Thank you for sharing this time with us.